Rain fell over New York the way it fell over Gotham, though the resemblance ended there. Here, the storm did not silence the city, it amplified it. Neon logos bled across wet pavement, billboards preached the gospel of Vought International, and every rooftop screen replayed the same smiling faces in an endless loop of manufactured heroism. Somewhere above the skyline, a caped celebrity waved for a camera drone while a burning car cooled behind him, forgotten. The applause was louder than the sirens. This was a world where salvation had a price tag, where courage was licensed, and where the word hero had been trademarked into meaninglessness. Crime was not fought in this place. It was scheduled, rehearsed, and merchandised. Behind every rescue stood an accountant. Behind every accountant stood a boardroom. And behind the boardroom, unseen but ever present, moved the quiet machinery of Vought, shaping the truth into whatever sold best that quarter. Miles away in a laboratory buried beneath a lightning-lashed tower, an experimental energy core shuddered against its containment. Engineers shouted over alarms as reality itself began to bend, thinning like old fabric pulled across a blade. At that same moment, in a city that existed on the far side of the veil, a shadow crouched on a rain-soaked cornice above a Wayne tech vault, studying the signature of a stolen dimensional prototype. Two anomalies reached for each other across the impossible dark. They touched, and the world rearranged itself around a single silent figure. He woke on a fire escape above an alley that smelled of gasoline and cheap perfume. The skyline was wrong. The stars were wrong. Even the rain tasted wrong, tinged with something metallic and manufactured. Bruce Wayne did not move for a long time. He listened, he watched, he learned. A mugger below hesitated when a distant boom shook the clouds, not out of hope for rescue, but out of terror that a hero might arrive and level the block to catch him, fear of the Guardians. That was the first clue. The second came from the televisions glowing behind rain-streaked windows. Anchors laughed as a smiling man in red, white, and blue described a collapsed apartment building as an acceptable outcome. Advertisements followed the body count. A children's cereal bore the same face that had, moments earlier, shrugged at the dead. Batman watched without expression. Somewhere beneath the cowl, a quiet, familiar anger began to sharpen into purpose. He did not announce himself. He did not seek allies. Within hours, he had slipped into the arteries of the city, tapping fiber lines, mirroring encrypted channels, ghosting through Vaught's internal servers as easily as he moved through Gotham's rooftops. What he found there did not surprise him so much as confirm a suspicion older than this world. The heroes here were not born. They were brewed. A compound, a syringe, a signature on a non-disclosure agreement. Gods pressed out of chemicals and marketing. By the time dawn crept over the harbor, the first arrests had begun. A human trafficker woke bound to a lamppost outside a federal building, a folder of evidence taped to his chest. A corrupt councilman was found in his own office, laptop open, every hidden account exposed. A crime boss known for owning half the docks was delivered to a precinct with a note that no camera ever caught being placed. There were no interviews. There were no logos. There was no triumphant landing for the cameras, only results. Newsrooms panicked, publicists scrambled. Vaught's analysts assumed a rival firm had entered the market, some unlicensed competitor testing a new product line. High above the city, however, a pale figure hovered in the clouds, listening to a silence that no one else could hear. Homelander did not know the name of the thing moving beneath him. He only knew that for the first time in his manufactured life, something in his kingdom refused to look up at him. Batman had not come to save this world. He had come to understand it, and understanding, he knew, was always the first cut. Bruce Wayne had spent a lifetime dismantling criminal empires, but Vought International was something new. It did not hide in warehouses or basements. It advertised itself on the sides of buses and the backs of cereal boxes. Its corruption was not buried. It was celebrated. And that, he understood at once, was the most dangerous kind of evil. The sort that no longer needed to lie because the world had already agreed not to look. He worked from an abandoned subway station beneath the harbor, a forgotten artery of a forgotten city. Screens flickered along the tiled walls, each one a different lens turned upon the empire above. Financial records, shipping manifests, redacted government contracts. Names of children who had vanished from orphanages decades ago and reappeared, years later, wearing capes. He traced the veins of Compound 5 from laboratory to boardroom to nursery, and with every discovery, the shape of the machine grew clearer. Vought did not sell heroes. It sold obedience. Every rescue was a rehearsal for the next election, every villain a controlled variable, every tragedy a marketing opportunity. Bruce had faced men who loved power. He had never before faced a corporation that had learned to farm it. While he worked, another hunter was already circling. Billy Butcher noticed him first through the absences. A trafficker gone before his crew could reach him. A dirty senator arrested before Butcher could threaten him. Files he had spent months chasing suddenly appearing anonymously in the inboxes of honest journalists. Someone was walking his hunting grounds and doing it better. Butcher did not take kindly to competition. Their first meeting took place on a rooftop above a shuttered slaughterhouse. Butcher arrived with 2 men and a shotgun, expecting to intimidate a rival. He found himself alone. The men behind him were already unconscious. The shotgun was already unloaded, and a voice behind him, low and unhurried, said his name as if reading it from a file. Butcher turned slowly. What he saw did not match anything in his understanding of this world. No cape emblem, no corporacho logo, no smile. Only a silhouette that seemed to belong more to the night than to the man wearing it. They spoke for a long time. Butcher tested him with insults, with threats, with lies. Batman answered none of them. He simply recited the last 2 weeks of Butcher's life, hour by hour, meeting by meeting, until the Englishman's grin faded and something like respect, or perhaps unease, took its place. When Butcher finally asked who the hell he was, Batman answered only that they wanted the same thing. They simply disagreed on the price. While Butcher wrestled with that answer, Batman turned his attention to the 7. He watched them for weeks, not as celebrities but as suspects. He learned the pauses in Starlight's smile, the way her eyes searched the crowd for a version of herself she had already lost. He studied Queen Maeve, whose armor was polished each morning by hands that no longer believed in what it stood for. He read the tremor in a train's fingers when the cameras were off, the panic of a man outrunning his own heartbeat. He noted Black Noir's stillness, the kind of silence that only forms around wounds too old to name. And then there was Homelander. Bruce watched him longest of all. He watched him laugh at charity galas and murder from the sky. He watched him kneel to speak to children and stare too long at his own reflection. He watched the micro-expressions no publicist could scrub, the flickers of loneliness beneath the perfect jaw, the trembling need behind the smile. And slowly, with the cold clarity of a diagnosis, Bruce understood. Homelander was not a man who had become a monster. He was a child who had been given the powers of a god and never taught how to be human. He did not want to rule the world. He wanted the world to love him. And nothing was more dangerous than a god who could not sleep without applause. To fight him with fists would be to lose. To fight him with fear would be to feed him. But to fight him with silence, with indifference, with a mirror held steady until he could no longer look away, that was a battlefield Batman had walked all his life. And on that ground, even a false god could bleed. The war began without a single punch. It began with a video, 37 seconds long, uploaded from a server that did not exist, posted to a forum no algorithm had ever indexed. In it, a Vought executive sat calmly at his desk describing, in his own voice, the disposal of a whistleblower he had ordered 18 months earlier. By the time Vaught's lawyers reached the platform, the clip had already been mirrored across 1,000 others. By dawn, it was on the morning news. By noon, the executive had vanished from his penthouse. By evening, he was awake in a federal holding cell, unable to remember how he had arrived. The next day, another video, then another, then a leaked spreadsheet, then a photograph, each one released without commentary, without threat, without any signature at all, save for a small black shape burned into the corner of every file, so subtle that most viewers missed it entirely. Those who noticed it began to whisper the same question in a dozen languages. Who was doing this? Vaught's counterintelligence division moved with the panic of an animal that had never before been prey. They doubled their firewalls. They tripled their surveillance. They hired new specialists, then fired them within days when the leaks continued. They accused competitors. They accused foreign governments. They accused their own employees. Nothing stopped the bleeding. The Empire began to itch beneath its own skin. Homelander watched it all from the observation deck of Vought Tower, arms folded, jaw tight. He had spent his entire life being feared. He had never, until now, been ignored. The invisible enemy did not tremble at his voice, did not challenge him on television, did not answer his threats with defiance. It answered nothing at all. It simply continued. And that, he began to realize with a slow and unfamiliar horror, was worse than any war he had ever imagined. He tried to bait it. He held press conferences designed to provoke. He arranged public tragedies, then rescued the survivors in front of cameras, daring the shadow to interrupt. He flew slow circuits above the city at night, listening for a heartbeat that did not belong. He heard millions. None of them were the one he wanted. Every silence in the sky felt like laughter aimed at him. Meanwhile, in a warehouse thick with the smell of old diesel and older regret, Billy Butcher watched the same footage that terrified Homelander and found himself, against every instinct, beginning to smile. He had spent years trying to make the world afraid of Vought. This stranger had done it in 11 days. Butcher hated him for it. Butcher admired him for it. And somewhere between those two feelings, a fragile, unwilling respect began to grow. He met Batman again on a broken pier, the harbor black as spilled ink beneath them. Butcher had questions now instead of threats. Why, he asked, did the man in the cowl keep leaving these bastards alive? Why hand them to a system that had already been bought 100 times over? Why not simply finish it? Batman did not answer at first. He watched the water, as if reading something written on its surface. Justice built on revenge, he said finally, eventually becomes another form of tyranny. Butcher laughed, but the laugh died halfway out of his throat. He had told himself for years that his rage was righteousness, that the line between vengeance and justice was only a coward's excuse. And yet here, on this pier, spoken by a man who had every reason to burn the world down and had refused to, the words landed somewhere Butcher could not defend. He said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was only to ask what came next. Batman told him. Evidence, deeper than anything yet released, was being assembled, not fragments, not scandals. A complete anatomy of Vought, from its earliest experiments to its most recent murders. Enough to end the corporation not with an explosion, but with a verdict. When it dropped, there would be no version of the story left for the publicists to salvage. Butcher nodded slowly. He did not agree. He did not disagree. He simply, for the first time in his life, listened. Above them, unseen in the low clouds, Homelander drifted in circles, chasing a silence that would not break. And somewhere behind that silence, a plan was already closing around him. Homelander broke first, as Batman had known he would. The declaration came on live television, unscripted, unapproved, and unmistakable. Standing on the polished stage of a Vought press event, the world's most beloved hero abandoned the teleprompter and spoke directly into the cameras. He named the shadow. He called it a coward. He called it a terrorist. He promised, with a smile that no longer reached his eyes, to drag it into the light and burn it in front of the world. The stock price collapsed before he finished speaking. Vought's publicists watched from the wings with the expressions of men witnessing the first crack in a dam they had built with their own hands. Batman watched from a bank of monitors deep beneath the harbor. He did not smile. He simply began the final preparations. The battlefield he chose was an abandoned industrial district on the western edge of the city, a graveyard of foundries and rail yards long since bankrupted by Vought's expansion. For 3 weeks he had walked its skeletons at night, mapping every catwalk, every gas line, every blind corner. He had stripped salvaged Vought research for its secrets and turned them, one by one, against their maker. Sonic emitters tuned to frequencies only enhanced ears could feel. Lamps calibrated to mimic the wavelength of a red dwarf sun, weakening a specific strand of engineered biology. Electromagnetic coils buried beneath the floors. Mirrors, angled with the patience of a chess master, arranged to reflect a face that had never truly been examined. When Homelander finally came, he came screaming. He tore through the outer wall of the foundry in a burst of concrete and light, expecting to find a man cowering behind machines. He found instead an empty corridor and the sound of his own footsteps returning to him from 1,000 hidden speakers, layered and delayed until they no longer sounded like his own. He shouted. The building shouted back. He laughed, unsteady, and the laughter came back distorted, older, smaller. The laughter of a boy who had grown up alone in a white room. He shattered the speakers. New ones woke behind him. He burned the mirrors. New ones lit further in. Every gesture of destruction only carried him deeper into the maze, and every deeper step drained something from him that he could not name. The sonic pulses tightened around his skull like a hand. The red spectrum lamps peeled the strength from his muscles by increments too small to notice until, all at once, they were noticed. His heat vision faltered. His hearing narrowed. He punched through a wall and found himself in a room lined with recordings of his own worst moments, unedited, unadvertised, unforgiven. And still, no enemy appeared. Only a voice, low and calm, speaking to him from everywhere and nowhere. It did not insult him. It did not threaten him. It simply asked questions. It asked him who he had been before the cape. It asked him what he thought love was, and whether he had ever truly received any. It asked him why a being who could hear every heartbeat on Earth could not stand the sound of his own. Homelander screamed then, not in rage, in something older. He tore through steel, through concrete, through his own reflection, chasing a shadow that stayed one turn ahead of him no matter how fast he flew. He burned corridors. He collapsed floors. He filled the darkness with light and found only more darkness waiting behind it. For the first time in his life, power was not enough. And that, for a man who had been built out of power, was a kind of death. When Batman finally appeared, he did so on a catwalk high above the foundry floor, unhurried, unarmed, unimpressed. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise a fist. He raised, instead, a small black device and turned it toward the sky. Every screen in the country lit up at once. Compound V the nurseries, the bodies buried under Vought's charity wings, the internal memos, the children who had been sold their own faces, the families whose deaths had been rewritten into origin stories. Not a montage, not a scandal. A verdict delivered in the language the world spoke best. Unbroken video, undistorted voices and receipts. It played on every network, in every home, in every phone, in every square. There was no press office in the world large enough to bury it. Homelander stood in the wreckage of his own maze and watched his myth die in real time. He watched his smile unmade. He watched the audience he had lived for turn its face away. He watched the applause of a decade unwind into a silence he could not fly out of. He looked up at the man on the catwalk with something between hatred and grief. Batman had never touched him. He had not needed to. The god was already broken. The morning after was quiet in a way the city had forgotten how to be. For the first time in living memory, no rooftop screen played a Vought commercial. The billboards had gone dark overnight, pulled by anxious sponsors who no longer wished to be photographed beside the logo. Newspapers carried only one story, printed in typefaces so large they seemed to be shouting through the paper. Talk shows abandoned their scripts. Congressional aides worked through the night with phones pressed to their ears and coffee going cold beside untouched briefings. Somewhere in a marble hallway, a senator who had spent 20 years defending Vought quietly began drafting his resignation. The arrests began before sunrise. Executives were led from their homes in bathrobes, cameras catching the faces they had spent decades keeping out of frame. Laboratories were sealed. Nurseries, hidden behind the smiling logos of charity foundations, were opened by federal agents who did not speak once the doors were closed behind them. Documents thought incinerated appeared in evidence lockers, delivered by no known courier, cataloged by no known hand. Every trail led forward, none led back. The Seven did not survive the week. A train sat on the edge of a hotel bed and watched his own commercials play, one after another, on a muted screen. He did not move for hours. Black Noir simply vanished, leaving behind a mask on a folded uniform in an empty locker, as if the man inside had finally been given permission to stop existing. Queen Maeve walked out of Vought Tower for the last time in ordinary clothes, refusing the elevator, taking the stairs the way a soldier leaves a battlefield she has finally admitted was never hers. Starlight stood before a microphone that had been prepared for someone else and told the truth for 18 unbroken minutes. And when she was done, she did not wait for questions. She simply walked away, and the world let her. Homelander was not seen at all. Somewhere above the clouds or below them, or in some quiet room without windows, he waited. The empire he had believed himself to be was dissolving without him, and no one Not the anchors, not the analysts, not even the frightened children who had once worn his face on their pajamas, was asking where he had gone. Through all of it, Batman remained unseen. Reporters searched for him. Governments extended invitations. A congressional committee formally requested his testimony. He answered none of them. Instead, he moved through the city as he always had, correcting quietly, guiding gently, refusing to become the next face on the next billboard. He gave his evidence to prosecutors, not to networks. He gave his methods to investigators, not to imitators. When a grateful mayor tried to award him a key to the city, he sent back only a single line, handwritten. Keys belong to citizens, not to shadows. He worked hardest, in those days, on the people. He funded independent newsrooms through channels that could never be traced to any single benefactor. He arranged, through anonymous intermediaries, training for detectives who had spent years being outranked by capes. He seeded neighborhoods with small, unglamorous programs, legal aid clinics, tutoring centers, community patrols staffed by residents rather than mercenaries. He was building, quietly and without ceremony, a world that would not need him. Butcher struggled with all of it. He walked beside Batman through a half-burned lot where a Vought recruitment center had once stood, and he could not stop asking the same question in different shapes. What about the ones already dead? What about Becca? What about the debts no arrest would ever repay? Homelander was breathing. He should not be. And every day the man in the cowl allowed that breath to continue felt, to Butcher, like a betrayal of the graves he carried in his chest. Batman listened. He always listened. And when Butcher finally ran out of words, Batman spoke, not as a judge, but as a man who had once stood at that same edge. Justice, he said, must outlive vengeance. If it dies with the men we hate, then we die with them too. Butcher did not answer. But that night, for the first time in years, he did not clean his gun before he slept. The ruins of Vought Tower stood against a bruised evening sky, half its glass gone, half its lights dead, its logo hanging crooked above the shattered lobby like a crown that no longer fit any head. Inside, dust drifted through corridors where publicists had once rehearsed apologies for crimes they had not yet committed. It was here, in the marble husk of a religion that no longer had a congregation, that Batman came for the last conversation. Homelander was already waiting. He sat on the edge of a broken fountain in what had once been the executive atrium, cape gone, insignia scratched away, hair unwashed. He did not rise when Batman entered. He only lifted his eyes, and in them was something Bruce had seen before, in every man he had ever pulled out of the darker corners of Gotham. Not rage. Exhaustion. Why, Homelander asked, had the shadow not killed him? He had given so many reasons. He had earned it 100 times over. He asked the question the way a child asks why a parent has not yet stopped loving him. Batman answered without cruelty and without softness. Killing you, he said, would have made you into a story. And stories, once written, are almost impossible to unwrite. The world does not need another martyr in a cape. It needs to learn how to live without them. Homelander laughed, and the laugh cracked. He spoke of the crowds that had loved him, the applause he could still hear when he closed his eyes, the terrible silence that had replaced it. He spoke of a boy in a white room who had never been held. He spoke of the men who had made him and the men who had used him, and how none of them had ever told him what he was for. He spoke, in the end, the way anyone speaks when they are finally too tired to lie. Batman did not interrupt. He did not forgive. He simply remained as he had remained in 100 other rooms across 100 other years, and let the silence do what silence does. Elsewhere in the city, Butcher stood in a doorway with a pistol in his hand and Homelander on a screen through a targeting lens. He had bought his way into the building. He had planned the shot for weeks. His finger rested on the trigger the way a prayer rests on a tongue. And in that long-waited moment, he heard again the voice on the pier. Justice built on revenge eventually becomes another form of tyranny. He heard Becca's laugh, from a summer that no bullet would ever bring back. He heard his own breath and did not recognize it. He lowered the pistol. He did not lower it because he had forgiven. He lowered it because, for the first time, he understood that forgiveness had never been the point. The point was what he wished to become. And a man who lived by the same rules as the thing he hated was already, in every way that mattered, the same thing. He turned, and he walked away. Outside the tower, the city moved without them. A bus stopped. A vendor closed his cart. A child asked her mother a question about the sky and received an answer that had nothing to do with capes. Small things. Ordinary things. The soft, unspectacular architecture of a world beginning, quietly, to belong to itself again. Batman watched it all from a high, dark window, exactly where he preferred to be. Months passed, and the city learned to breathe. Crime did not vanish, because crime is older than any hero, and no shadow can outlive it. Fear did not vanish either, because fear is the price of caring about anything at all. But the great, glossy religion of the cape was gone, and in its place something older and quieter began to grow. People spoke to their neighbors again. They knew the names of the officers on their corners. They read newspapers that named their sources and corrected their mistakes. Oversight boards were formed for enhanced individuals, and the boards had teeth, and the teeth were not for sale. Children stopped drawing Homelander on their notebooks. They drew, instead, firefighters, teachers, the woman down the hall who ran the food pantry, and sometimes, in the corner of a page, a small dark shape without a face. When asked who it was, they only shrugged and said he came when people needed him, and left before anyone could thank him. That was all. That was enough. In the abandoned station beneath the harbor, Bruce Wayne worked alone by the light of a single lamp. The dimensional device salvaged from the wreckage of the Vought laboratory that had first torn him into this world hummed on the table before him. It was almost whole. A few more calibrations, a few more hours. Butcher came to see him one last time. He did not bring a bottle. He did not bring a joke. He brought a folder, thick with the names of the honest, the people Batman had quietly gathered over the months. Investigators, journalists, prosecutors, 2 former members of the 7, a handful of officers who had refused promotions rather than take dirty ones. Butcher laid the folder on the table and said only that he would look after them. Bruce nodded once. It was, between them, more than an embrace. He gave Butcher the research, every file, every method, every countermeasure, enough to keep any future Vought from ever rising in the same shape. He told him, quietly, that the work would outlive them both, and that this was the point. Dawn came gray over the harbor. Bruce climbed to the surface for the last time and stood on a pier watching the light spread across water that no longer reflected any hovering shape in the sky. He activated the device. The air folded gently, without violence, and a soft doorway opened in the space between one breath and the next. Before he stepped through, he paused. He did not look back at the city. He looked up at the empty sky where a false god had once circled, and then down at the ordinary street where an ordinary woman was unlocking an ordinary shop. He allowed himself for a moment something that was almost a smile. Then he was gone, somewhere across town in a precinct that had lost half its command to indictments and the other half to shame. A young officer sat across from a man in an expensive coat. The man slid an envelope across the desk. It was thick. It was quiet. It was the kind of offer that had, for years, been simply accepted. The officer looked at the envelope for a long moment. He thought of no one in particular, and everyone at once. He pushed it back across the desk. Outside, the morning went on, and in a city that had finally learned to guard itself, the night, at last, belonged to no one but the stars.